McClelland received his PhD in cognitive psychology from the University of Pennsylvania in 1975. He served on the faculty of the University of California, San Diego, before moving to Carnegie Mellon in 1980. In 2006, McClelland moved to the Department of Psychology at Stanford University, where he is currently a Lucy Stern professor in the social sciences and the founding director of the Center for Mind, Brain, and Computation at Stanford. McClelland was a co-founder with David Newton, parallel distributed processing research, and together with others, he led the effort book, Parallel Distributed Processing, in which the parallel distributed processing framework was laid out and applied to a wide range of topics in cognitive psychology and cognitive neuroscience. Those were those big red volumes.
One blue. Yeah.
And conducts research on learning, memory, and conceptual development, decision-making, and mathematical cognition.
Okay, thank you. Either it's upside down or whatever, but maybe this will work. Okay, can you hear me? Great. Let's hit F5. Okay. I feel like the cart is coming after the horse here in a certain way, but I do want to share with you my perspective on a lot of the things that we've already heard about and emphasize some things that are maybe a little bit different and try to also touch on some new stuff. My title is very general here, but I'm going to mostly be talking about my views about natural intelligence, and then at the very end, I'm going to hit on a couple of recent developments in artificial intelligence that relate to what I'm going to say. I want to begin with my this is what they're going to put on my tombstone and well as other people's tombstones, and it's related to a question that was asked earlier. What do you mean by knowledge? Okay? It's the stuff that underlies your ability to say what is going to happen next in a setting where you've had previous experiences. It's the stuff that allows you to bring to mind what someone's name is when you see their face. It's the stuff that allows you to describe the properties of objects in the world. It's the stuff that allows me to stand here and spew out sentences at a very rapid rate in a language that I know very well. And what is that knowledge? It's in your connections. It's a bunch of changes that occurred to the connections among the neurons that participate in the process of generating the behavior. So an experience, if we're thinking about memory, an experience is a pattern of activation over neurons in one or more brain regions. And we could imagine some input coming in at the top on this diagram that produces such a pattern of activation. And what's the trace that's left behind in the nervous system after the experience? Well, it's essentially the matrix of connection weight changes that occurred as a result of that experience. Now, each experience leaves behind a trace, so we always have some memory for each experience, but we can't separate that trace from all the other ones because it's superimposed on them in the same set of connections. Of course, there's some separation of different groups of neurons, and different connections may be involved to differing degrees, but to an extent at least, many connections are affected, most connections are affected by many different experiences. And so the memories are all, in a sense, superimposed. And this is something I believe not only about cortical memories, but also about hippocampal memories, just a difference in degree. So what does recall involve? So suppose that pattern coming in there, half of the neurons represented somebody's name and the other features of their face, and I saw their face again and I wanted to retrieve their name. Well, that's a process of pattern completion, and it involves using the activations produced by one part of the input to then use the connection changes to reconstruct the pattern that was there before. but always, because the neurons involved are also involved in many, many other associations, this process is going to be one that depends not just on the experience itself, but also on many other experiences. And therefore, your memory is always constructed rather than, explicitly retrieved, like it might be if you'd written something on a piece of paper in your wallet and pulled it back out again, right? It's a very different kind of thing. And whenever we think about memory, we have to think about the fact that it's not just the experience itself that leads to the performance afterwards. It's the entire ensemble of previous and subsequent experiences that together result in the memory performance with the experience itself. Okay, so within the context of that view, many years ago, I formulated with Bruce McNaughton, who was extremely influential in this particular thinking, and guided by the earlier work of David Marr, before he became an AI researcher, while he was still a cognitive computational neuroscientist at the very earliest stages of that field, in which there are basically three simple ideas. One is that connections within and among neocortical brain areas, and I should include other areas outside of the hippocampus in this, some basal ganglia maybe, and others, but lumping them together with the cortex here, support gradual acquisition of structured knowledge through interleaved learning. That is to say, we have a wide range of different experiences over time. We encountered dogs and cats interleaved with each other and all kinds of other things, and we gradually learn over developmental time, and that knowledge is encoded in the connections in and among neurons, let's say outside of the medial temporal lobes. Then if we're going to learn something new, rapid learning in connections within the hippocampus or the medial temporal lobe supports this initial learning of especially arbitrary new information. And then, of course, there must be some communication between these two systems, and that's the blue connection. So bidirectional connections link the neocortical representation to the hippocampus MTL for storage, retrieval, and replay. A critical feature of all of this is that those bidirectional connections are, in my view, part of the slow learning system. They also have structured knowledge in them so that the inputs and outputs of the hippocampus are sort of essentially coordinated with what's known in the cortex. That's one very important point. The other very important point here is that what's learned in the hippocampus depends on the representation that were previously established by cortical learning. They're not just the raw sensory input being dumped into that. They're actually coming from the higher association areas, and we tried to indicate that on this slide by having those green hubs be coming from the higher association parts of the brain and not from the basic sensory areas. And then finally, of course, you've heard so much about replay, I won't have to say that much about that, but reactivation of these patterns in the hippocampus, either because a cue comes along and somebody asked me to recall that name that I associated with that face earlier today, or because of some spontaneous reactivation, then allows this stuff to get played back out to the cortex, which is then, of course, the substrate through which it's expressed in behavior. The hippocampus doesn't talk to our output systems directly. So I just want to say these things, if I don't get to everything in my talk today, maybe this is the take-home message. Structure is important, not just the contents of specific experiences or memories. Secondly, the cortex is crucial for structure learning. And so I'm going to be emphasizing cortical side in my talk today. And that'll be, you should recognize that. I want to, though, also emphasize, and this will be the part that I hopefully get to at the end, that the hippocampal system works with this structured knowledge acquired by the cortex to allow fast learning based on this gradually acquired structured knowledge. Okay, so this is This is something that I think we've studied less than would be desirable, but is going to turn out to be more and more interesting, and hopefully the main body of the content of what I'm going to say is going to motivate that pretty well. Okay, so just to bring home this basic point about the importance of the cortex, if you were to have your hippocampus removed on both sides of your brain, it would have a profound impact on your ability to learn new things. But the key point here is that it wouldn't affect your performance on an IQ test. It wouldn't affect your general knowledge of the world. It wouldn't have any effect on your ability to speak your native language, and it wouldn't affect other skills that you had previously acquired, okay? It's robbing you of the ability to learn new things quickly and the ability to retrieve things that you recently learned, but doesn't deprive you of your knowledge, right? The long-term things that you know that have been consolidated into the rest of the system. And so that's, I guess, to me, the most interesting part. Yes, there are critical elements of the hippocampus too, but how the cortex learns and makes us able to be brilliant mathematicians or insightful therapists or whatever it is that we are, that's in your cortex. Okay, so I'm going to spend hopefully just a few minutes with very, very old material, which comes from work that I did with a PhD student who then I continued to collaborate with for several years after, on the emergence of meaning and learned distributed representations through gradual interleaved learning. This is really about the cortical learning process. It's also going to be very closely tied to what we're going to think about as we come to more recent work as well, so this is grounding for that. So basically we're going to see how distributed representations, or what machine learning calls embeddings, that capture aspect of meanings emerge through a gradual learning process. And with Tim, we actually wrote a whole book on this, applying these ideas to semantic cognitive development, and looking at a bunch of phenomena. The list is longer than the 3 points I've got here, and for interest of time, I'm just going to focus on the first one highlighted in red, which is this idea, which I think is a fairly fundamental one, that the progression of learning and the representations formed capture a kind of a progressive differentiation process that occurs over the course of semantic and cognitive development. So to illustrate what I mean by that, I'm going to show you this slide here. This comes from actual experimental data. These are examples of children in 4 different age groups, kindergarten up to 6th grade, who were asked questions like, is it okay or silly to say that a chair is awake? Okay, so if a kid said that's silly, and he also said it's silly to say it's not awake, we'd say the kid doesn't think that that predicate applies to a chair. So chair would not be under that predicate, okay? So this tree is called a predicability tree, and it sort of shows what this kindergartner thought about what you could predicate of different things. So the kid thought, for example, that it was okay to say that a pig was sorry, okay? But not a chair was sorry or awake. And the key thing to take away from this is that as kids get older, their predicability trees become more differentiated. So younger kids tend to lump humans and inanimate things, and older kids tend to disaggregate them. These are just example children, but these are typical examples of this phenomenon. Okay, so how can interleaved learning in a cortex-like neural network help us understand this? Well, this is where my colleague, former sort of mentor and collaborator, David Rummelhart, started us down this road, because David was one of the first people who actually asked, in the context of the earlier 1980s neural network revolution, okay, how can we think in a connectionist way about the knowledge that we have, about facts even, like we tend to think, oh, a robin can fly is a declarative, explicit fact. We might write it down as though in a book. We might store it in a linked list. But a neural network could learn it too in a kind of a pattern completion kind of way. And here's the network that David proposed for this. Obviously, it's very abstractly related to the human neocortex, right? But I believe it's a good analogy. And so what David did was he constructed a training set consisting of input items together with a relation or a context, to generalize that word just a tiny bit. And so the input to the neural network here in this example is Robin can. And the task the network has is to produce on its output the things that a robin can do. Okay? So a robin can grow, move, and fly. And so that would be the teaching output for this. So you could imagine at different times you heard people say things to you like, gee, isn't it interesting that robins can fly? And you would witness events in which they moved, and you found information about them growing from various sources. And so you would learn to make these predictions about robins, not necessarily solely from linguistic propositions, but at least in part from such propositions. And you would learn about other properties, like robins they have wings and feathers and scales and so on. So the training set Rumelhart made up for this was just all the propositions that are true of the items pine oak, rose, daisy, robin, canary, sunfish, and salmon. They're at the bottom of this tree. And so, for example, we talked about the robin example. This tree contains the information that the robin can grow, move, and fly, because in this representation, the robin is a bird, the bird can fly, the bird is an animal, the animal can move, and the animal's a living thing, and it can grow. Okay, so it turns out that some things are true of everything in this tree, like grow, and other things are only true of subsets of the things in this tree. And this tree is an economical way of representing that information in propositional form. What happens when we teach the neural network with the contents of the information in this tree? That's what Rumelhart explored. Our initial contribution to this was really just to start looking at the time course of learning, inspired by Frank Kyle's evidence, knowing what David shown about what eventually is learned. And here's what you see early on in learning. Now, what we're looking at is the patterns of activation over that representation layer that the network has at different points in learning. And that is to say, you're supposed to see the connections as full. So each unit is connected to all the units at the next layer. I've only shown some of them there on the graph. But when we activate Robin, that's going to produce a pattern over the representation layer. So the knowledge in the connection weights from Robin to that representation is going to be reflected in the activation on the representation layer. And these are the activations produced by the 8 different concepts after 50 epochs of training. One of the things that we learned very, very early on in training deep neural networks, that is to say networks with more than with at least one layer of hidden units in between the input and the output, is that learning initially is very slow. So actually, even after 50 epochs of training, what you're basically seeing there in these early patterns, and each one of those little histogram bars represents the activation of one of the neurons, is the random initial information that was in the initial random weights that the network was initialized with, because learning hasn't really gotten off the ground yet. But if you look at 150 epochs, you can see that learning has now occurred, and that the network has differentiated concepts considerably. It's treating the salmon and the sunfish as very similar, but they're quite well differentiated from the robin and the canary. And you can see that all those animals are very well differentiated from all the plants. You can see the plants are quite similar to each other, but there are subtle and systematic differences such that the trees are more different, more similar to each other than either of them are to the rose and the daisy. Okay, so if we do hierarchical clustering analysis on this, we see that initially there's no coherent structure. It's random and undifferentiated. And after 150 epochs, we've recapitulated that same tree that the data set came out of. The network pulled out that structure. But at an intermediate point, the network picked out the strongest dimension of the content of the training set, which is the information that differentiates the plants from the animals. And in this way, it demonstrates this progressive differentiation phenomena. Okay, so I raced through that because I have so much more to say, but maybe this is a good point to take any very basic questions about this before I go on. Everybody feel like this is Neural Networks 101 and we've all had that class by now? You know, it's funny because 25 years ago, I'd get nothing but blank stares when I went through this stuff. But I kind of, thanks to recent resurgence of interest in this stuff, this is a little bit more familiar to more people. Okay, so now we get to the phenomenon that many people today have already touched on, which is the problem that can arise if we've gradually acquired structure, but we want to learn something new. And this is the problem that goes under the name of catastrophic interference. And it was studied first by McClelland and Cohen, and their basic response was, hey, human memory shows some interference, but neural networks show catastrophic interference. In their simulation, everything was forgotten before anything new was learned. And so let's throw these things out and start over. Well, I wasn't ready for that, but I did think that they were right in part. So I studied this particular case, the penguin. So what would happen? Whoa. Something happened funny on my screen here, but you're still seeing the right thing, so who knows? Let's see what happens. What I did here, is to take the network that already knew what you had already seen, so trained already, and I added one new unit with randomly initialized connections. You can see it there, I hope, in red with the randomly initialized green connections. I then trained the whole network now with the following two items. Penguin is a living thing, an animal, a bird, right? Penguins are birds. And then penguin can grow, move, and swim. So this information is partly consistent with what the network already knows, but partly inconsistent in that all the birds can fly and not swim, and all the fish swim and don't fly, right? So this kind of is a mixing of bird and fish characteristics. And if I just train my neural network with these two items, I was able to cause it to learn them at a reasonably rapid rate. This is just presenting those two items interleaved with each other and looking at the error in the network's output. But the consequence of this was to mess up the network's knowledge of the other birds and fish. So it would basically say for all of them after this training, it's a bird, it can swim. So it's messing up the information about the birds for what they can do and the fish for what they're called, basically. So that's not good. But if I had given HM this information, right? If I tried to tell HM about some new information, he wouldn't have learned it. His cortex would not have allowed him to absorb this. Because according to this theory, and there's a subtlety we're going to get to, but according to this theory, the integration of new information into the cortical system is a gradual process. And indeed, HM really, learned new things at an extremely slow rate. He did eventually learn that John F. Kennedy had been president, and he had his lesion in '53, so that was definitely new learning. But it took a long time, right? And that was one of the very few things that he learned. So, with the billions and billions of exposure he probably had to Kennedy during the period of the 60s, he also had lots of other exposure to other things. So the basic idea here is that we use our hippocampus as a place to store novel information, which we can then interleave with either reactivations from our hippocampus or from our cortex, or ongoing exposure from the environment that we have to other other relevant information. And that will allow us to learn this new information eventually in a way that's consistent with, that integrates it into our long-term knowledge. So the complementary learning systems theory simply says, okay, that cortical system is there. The medial temporal lobe allows us to learn this new stuff rapidly. And basically, you've already heard that story many times, so I'll go over this quickly. So let's see what happens when we actually do this learning in an interleaved way. So here, all I did was I just added these two new items about the penguin to the training set from before, and I presented the full training set on each epoch of training. So it actually slowed down the learning in the cortex of the new information about the penguin, and this is actually, I think, a valid observation about pre-trained networks. They're actually resistant to knowledge that's inconsistent with the structure that they already have, especially if there's other examples that illustrate this structure. Interestingly enough, it would have integrated it better had it been in the training set from the beginning. And I think this tells us something about old brains and new tricks and things like that. But even so, it does gradually integrate the new information, okay? And the benefit of the interleaved learning is that it doesn't produce the interference. So the existing memories, in this protocol at least, were unaffected, virtually unaffected by interleaving this with the old knowledge. So the idea is that our hippocampus provides us with this system that allows us to rapidly learn new information without it interfering with what we already know, and then gradually interleave it and consolidate it if it turns out to be stuff that's important for us. Now, finally, I'm going to get to the part of the talk where we're addressing new things and building, though, on what you've already heard. And I'm going to talk about rapid consolidation of schema-consistent information. So this is the idea that Richard Morris and his lab promoted in a series of absolutely incredible studies that they published in 2 science papers in 2007 and 2011. And although I'm going to come to a slightly different conclusion than Richard came to, I believe these are amazing experiments. I'm going to describe them to you briefly. So Richard was referring to this very phenomenon whereby if you already have prior knowledge relevant to the topic of a talk, you will be able to assimilate that information and retrieve it and retain it afterwards. But if you don't, if you're the first-year graduate student who wandered into the colloquium and had never heard about neural networks or something, you forget about it, right? You would learn absolutely nothing from my talk. And so I resonated with that from my previous experiences with audiences who didn't learn anything from my talk. And what he did to illustrate this was to create a maze. So your top-down sort of schematic of it is shown on the left, and an actual photograph is shown on the right. The idea is that it's a rectangular arena, and a rodent can be placed in a start box, a rat. You can see a start box in the lower middle of the photograph on the right. The start box can be placed on any of the 4 sides of the arena, importantly. So the rat can't just learn a path. He has to learn how to find things from any location. And what happens in this world is that while in the start box, the rat is given a little tiny taste of a food that's been flavored with a particular flavoring, like, let's say, milk. And then there's going to be a bunch more food out there in the environment in the location. It'll still be flavored with milk, but it'll also be in a specific location that's indicated by the milk carton there. Hopefully you see that there. And so the animal's going to learn about this over the course of many training sessions. I'm not going to go through the data in gory detail. I'm going to make my points quickly to hopefully cover more ground here, but hopefully you get the visual sense out of this that the initial learning of these flavor place associations is gradual. The animal gets 1 trial each day of each of these 6 flavor place associations, and only starts to show above chance performance around day 6 or so, and then continues to get better. And they practice for a while. There's a couple of probe tests. Then the crucial events occur, okay? So on day 21 over there, you can see here, the print's fairly small, but on this day, 2 new associations are presented. And they're presented in locations near the locations that 2 of the old associations had been presented in. Hopefully you see that there. Let's say they're beer-flavored food and hot dog-flavored food in those 2 locations. Okay, so what happens? Well, the animals are actually able to learn these new associations in one trial. Okay, so rapid schema-consistent learning. And critically also, they retain that learning even if the hippocampus is removed 48 hours after the original experience, which is considered to be a very short amount of time for consolidation, given the consolidation gradients are often extended over weeks or months, and in humans over years. So the argument was that this information was not only learned quickly, but also integrated into the neocortical network very quickly. And they did other experiments to suggest that the period that the hippocampus needed to be on board after the initial learning was restricted to 6 or so hours, and further that the hippocampus was required to learn a new pair of associates. So the animals who had the hippocampal lesions couldn't learn another pair after the hippocampal lesions. The ones who hadn't learned another new pair just fine. Okay, so that's the last panel of the graph. So we can rapidly learn new things that are consistent with our schemas. Crucially, you take these animals, you put them in a physically identical plexiglass maze, but in a different room with a different arrangement of holes in the floor, different distal cues around the walls, different proximal cues inside the maze. There is no transfer whatsoever. So what they have learned is a schema for relating information to locations in a familiar environment and not just in general to solve this task, okay? Okay, so Richard says, look, McClelland's all wrong. The hippocampus, the cortex doesn't learn slowly. Cortex can learn very fast. And I'm like, oh, I said it wrong, didn't I? Okay, so what I'm going to show you in the next couple minutes is that the very setup we've already seen provides a context in which to see that indeed learning can be very quick if the knowledge has been set up appropriately and the information to be learned is consistent with what's been learned. Okay, so let's talk about schemas and schema-consistent information. So what is a schema? It's probably the most badly abused word in cognitive science. And Rumelhart actually wrote papers about, schemas and, and I used to say, schema shmema, it's just our cognitive knowledge and you don't have any specific things called schemas in your head. But we can talk about a schema as an organized knowledge structure into which existing knowledge is organized. And, fortuitously, this tree that I showed you before kind of helps to illustrate this point, right? Because we've been able to organize those trees and flowers and birds and fish into categories which themselves are organized into higher categories and so on. But if we think about the penguin in this context, it actually doesn't fit, right? It's neither fish nor fowl, as you would say. And so we have to carve out we have to change the structure to integrate the penguin into the knowledge. So my point is going to be that it's only when the new information is not consistent with what you already know that it's hard to learn it. So how do I show this? Well, very simple. I already said this, I think. The penguin we talked about. But what about a trout or a cardinal? Now, just as before, I'm going to just add one new unit to my model. I'm going to use this for either the penguin or the trout or the cardinal. Okay, so one of those three things. The network's going to learn about one new animal. And I use the trout and the cardinal to sort of counterbalance across those two categories, but crucially, it's only learning about one of those at a time, although it could learn about both because they're both schema consistent. But we're just comparing learning about the penguin to learning about either the trout or the cardinal. And so I create my new unit as before, and I present the network with one of the following pairs of items. So penguin is a penguin can. We already saw that. Trout is a trout can. Now this is consistent, right? Trout is a fish and it can swim. Similarly, the cardinal is a bird and it can fly. Now, crucially, it doesn't know whether it's going to be a trout or a cardinal yet, so it is arbitrary information in some sense, but it can be placed in the schema. Either the trout or the cardinal can be placed into the schema without difficulty. And so what happens is that the network learns this new information even faster than it learned the penguin. This is with no interleaving at all. It's just the presentations of the penguin or the trout. And there's a lot of interference with the penguin, as we saw before, but there's hardly any interference when you learn about the trout or the cardinal. Right? So it learns it quickly, and it doesn't interfere with what it already knows because it's able to fit it into its pre-existing knowledge. Okay. So there's one really cool thing that was found in the subsequent paper, the 2011 paper that I alluded to before, and that is that when the animals were exposed to these two new associates, and then they were sacrificed shortly after that experience, and then the investigators examined their brains, they noticed the upregulation of various intermediate early genes that are associated with synaptic plasticity in the cortex. Okay, so compared to an animal that just saw the old example, so that's the OPA example here, the animals who saw 4 old ones on the special day and then the 2 new ones showed this big upregulation of gene expression. And animals placed in a brand new environment, never seen it before, 6 new associations, much less gene induction in the cortex. It's like the cortex doesn't change when you're exposed to garbage that you can't interpret. Beautiful finding. I just loved it. And that's kind of close to what happens in the neural network. The connection weights at the input to representation layer change very strongly and very systematically when the network is trained with the trout or the cardinal. And, but they don't change anything like to the same extent with the same amount of exposure to the penguin. Why? Because it's canceling. It's sending signals that say, make me a bird, and others that say, make me a fish. Okay, but with the cardinal, it's like, make me a bird, make me a bird. And with the fish, it's make me a fish, right? So I did this experiment in thousands of different ways, and all of them came out roughly similarly. Interestingly enough, even 6 random associations, which have nothing to do with the structured knowledge, produce very little change to those deep weights. They do produce more change to the output weights. They cause more kind of reorganization of the rest of the network, as you can perhaps see in the white bars. But even then, they're all sort of canceling each other out to a large extent. And for this problem, of course, the learning can all happen at the input to representation weights. Why? Because it's just saying the same thing about that cardinal that it used to say about the other birds. So it can use that same representation. Obviously, in the real world, things almost always involve some novelty and some consistency, yeah, okay. So why does it work? well, I think I've kind of already hinted at that, but basically the error signals that drive learning in a neural network depends on the connection weights that are already there. The backpropagation algorithm sends the error signals through the existing weights back to the representation layer, and they happen to be propagated strongly when they're consistent with what's already known, and they're also consistent across the different elements of the training experience, so it accumulates and bang, you get rapid learning. Okay, emphasizing, I didn't change the learning rate. The learning rate, the rapid learning occurred because the error signals propagated more strongly and coherently after learning. So, right. Okay, so I've rattled on at a blindingly fast pace, it feels like, but, and I've really only talked about the cortex so far. And in the last part of what I want to say here, I'm going to place a bit more emphasis on the hippocampus and the medial temporal lobe. And I'm going to say something about why the differences between them. Okay, so I have this view that the changes in the connections in the cortex are governed by a lower learning rate than the ones in the hippocampus. But also there's another very fundamental aspect of the thinking that at least I've done on this, and that both David Marr and Bruce McNaughton. Oh, and there's Jeff, who's about.
I wanted to ask you a question before you switch.
Okay.
I didn't get how you differ from Richard Morris's conclusions on the schema, because it seems like your representation is learning very fast when it fits within the schema.
Yes, no, that's true. I just disagreed with him that the complementary learning systems theory was wrong. He said the theory's all wrong. It's not good. And I said, oh, I just didn't express it very well. So thank you for that question. Reading the text of our 1995 paper, you would get the impression that the cortex always learns slowly, and that was a mistaken impression that I conveyed because I didn't discuss the fact that the penguin was, inconsistent and things like that. Okay. So thank you for your question, Jeff. But Jeff, this next point is going to come straight to you and to my comment on your talk before. So I'm going to hit you with a slide. This slide, this top figure, part of the figure, was recorded in a paper by Barnes and McNaughton, published in the 80s. While a rodent was walking in and out on the 8 arms of a 8-arm radial maze, okay? And this is just an example of a neuron, actually from the entorhinal cortex on the left and the CA3 area of the hippocampus on the right. And this iconic image sort of stuck in my mind as a kind of a statement about the idea that the cortex uses overlapping distributed representation, and the hippocampus uses extremely sparse and non-overlapping representations. So, what you see in the neuron in the left is that it responds a bit more while the animal is walking out on the arms, those are the white bars, than when he's walking in, and a bit more in the sort of late middle part of the arm than in the early part of the arm, and a bit more in the arms down there on the lower right than on the other arms, and it's kind of carrying a little bit of information about all those different aspects of the situation. Whereas the CA3 neuron there responds only when the animal is going out on one arm of the maze with a tiny bit of noise on other arms. Okay, so a highly conjunctive representation in the hippocampus and a highly overlapping representation in the entorhinal cortex. This is probably an overstatement. If we look in the cortex, we see varying degrees of sparsity at different points. But part of my reason for thinking that overlapping distributed representations are useful is that they allow for things that are true across a wide range of different entities or things to be captured in the representation of all of them. If all the animals share some aspect of their pattern of activation together, then things that are true of all animals are robustly represented in the network. And the representations acquired by the Rumelhart network have that characteristic. And in work that I don't have time to tell you about today, when we degrade those representations by randomly removing units, neurons, one by one, we produce a graceful degradation of semantic knowledge that recapitulates the pattern of degradation that you see in patients with a condition called semantic dementia. What happens in these patients is they lose knowledge of the idiosyncratic properties of objects before they lose knowledge of their general properties, and they over-regularize atypical properties towards the typical properties, but they know that a tiger is still some kind of an animal, so that it's not like they remember that it has stripes, they just know it's an animal. Okay, so that there's some residual knowledge of the tiger even though the knowledge of its specific properties are not retained. And that's a property of these overlapping distributed representations, which we've been able to capture using them. So that's my reason for holding to at least the idea that they play an important role. Maybe they're not as overlapping as that, and that's obviously an ongoing discussion. But yes, sir. Okay, I'm simplifying for you here. That's actually the entorhinal cortex. So the entorhinal cortex here is, on the boundary zone between the neocortex and the archicortex. It's sort of this intermediate kind of cortex, and some people lump it together with the medial temporal lobe. I treat it as being the sort of top end of the slow learning cortical system. The entorhinal cortex itself is actually a very diverse structure. There's substructures within it. This is probably an example of a neuron that's probably as kind of densely coded as any, and there's a diversity of neuron types. One thing, this is maybe a side point, but it's something that Bruce McNaughton has been emphasizing. He's now on sabbatical visiting us at Stanford this quarter, and what he emphasizes is that there's a distribution of the extent to which neurons are activated across contexts. Okay, so it's not the case that all neurons are equally sparse or all neurons are equally dense. There's some that are activated across many contexts and others that are activated very sparsely in particular contexts. And maybe that's just an extreme example, and these are just two extreme examples that illustrate that continuum. Okay, so I'm gonna move on now, but my starting place here has been what I learned from Bruce when he came and gave a talk at Carnegie Mellon in about 1989 or something, which is that the hippocampus does pattern separation. It takes similar patterns and it makes them different. And how it does that is very simple. It has units that only respond when particular combinations of inputs are active. So these units here respond when particular pairs of input units are active. And you can see these two patterns overlap in 2 out of 3 of their active neurons, but the conjunctions only share 1 unit in common because there's only 1 pair that's active in common between the two. And so this is using a second-order conjunctive code, just pairs. You get already some degree of pattern separation. If you imagine 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 100th, 1000th order conjunctive coding, you'd get very, very strong pattern separation. There's some technical details on what makes that possible that Marr actually worked out in his early work, but we're not going to go into that now. We have this idea that the hippocampus is going to relatively separate things and so that they're more distinct from each other. This would allow us to learn new things rapidly without them interfering as much with other things. But still, there's some degree of overlap, right? And that's going to mean some degree of connection overlap as well. Okay, so in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through the gory details of this slide. Happy to come back to it later. How much more time do I have?
Actually, we're out of time.
We're out of time? Okay, so you'll give me 3 more minutes then. And that way I'll be able to say something about artificial intelligence. Skipping that. Okay, so So complementary learning systems have been used in artificial intelligence recently, and this led to me having an opportunity to write a paper together with a couple of the key researchers at Google DeepMind, where we talked about biological and artificial intelligences. And so just very, very briefly, there's this the first breakthrough of DeepMind was showing that you could train a convolutional neural network, essentially, to learn how to play a wide range of different Atari games. Each network learns one Atari game in this context, but still. And the way they got it to work was that they had a huge rehearsal buffer where they stored episodes that had occurred as the neural network played the game in literal form, and then they played them back, interleaved with each other, so as to allow the network to learn the general problem and not be dominated by sort of local correlations that happen to occur when you're playing a particular game with a particular strategy. And this was basically the only way that they could successfully train a deep neural network. So the deep neural network ultimately is like your neocortex, I would argue, in that it's just a parameterized neural network that maps from inputs onto judgments about what's the best thing to do right now. But it relies extensively on this rehearsal buffer to allow that thing to learn. So it's an amplification of the complementary learning systems idea in spades, with sort of essentially 1,000-fold repetition of each stored item interleaved with, coupled with a little bit of direct experience as you gather new data when you actually play, right? So it's a drastic amplification of this idea. There's another model called the differentiable neural computer, which I will skip in the interest of time. I just want to share one more slide with you, and then I'll stop, and hopefully we'll have a little time for other things then. Okay, so this is the work of my PhD student who's actually just gone off to take a job at DeepMind. It's called Deep Episodic Value Iteration. And if you don't get all the details, I won't be surprised. But basically, it combines this idea that one might store what you gathered about specific episodes in the hippocampus and then iterate over those to essentially figure out what to do at various locations in a space. But that'll only work if you know how to represent the space. And so he's actually used this to model the experiment by Tsay et al. That I described earlier from the Morris lab, in which before you have this learned model of how to represent locations in space, you can't learn the associations very well. But as you gradually explore the space and find these foods in these different locations, so he trains it with 6 locations, in the same way, it gradually learns this way of mapping from the arbitrary patterns over hippocampal place cells onto a lower dimensional representation that captures the actual two-dimensional structure of the environment. And after it's learned that, it can explore the space just once with a new association, store the sub-episodes of that event in the hippocampus, iterate over them to figure out what action would make sense given where you are now based on a similarity-based generalization using the learned similarity kernel. So the similarity kernel is the slow learning part, and the episodic memory stores the individual episodes. So once you've learned the similarity kernel, you have it to use, and you can learn from just enough exploration to get you to the food. And I'm oversimplifying a little bit. So this is how the hippocampus and the cortex could work together. A slow learning system could acquire the similarity kernel. The fast learning system could learn the episodes of your experience. You could reason over those episodes using your similarity kernel to tell you how to generalize appropriately and therefore succeed in performing well after just one experience with a new association. So I'll stop there. Thank you. Are you asking a question? I can't tell. No. Okay. Yeah.
The similarity kernel, is it boiling things down to like a single similarity metric?
Yeah, so I'm sorry I didn't have a chance to explain that. So basically, it's a convolutional neural network that takes vectors in at the bottom and feeds them through forward through a neural network to get a pattern at the top layer. How does it learn what that pattern should be? It learns it by using the set of stored episodes that are in the hippocampus, trying to backpropagate reward information through the series of episodes to figure out what action you should take in an early step of a multi-step sequence. So using value iteration over a set of stored exemplars. That's the value iteration part. But then at each step of the value iteration, it's in some state which might be different from any of the other states it's ever been in before. It has to use a similarity kernel to figure out which next state is the best one to use. That's where the similarity kernel comes in. But the value iteration is what gives the similarity kernel learning the information about how it should change. So you don't need direct supervision in terms of class labels or anything. You just need the outcome of the eventual episodes, like you finally stumbled into the food, to get the reward information that trains the whole convolutional network. But you need the episodic memory to propagate these signals around so that you get the learning signals to teach that thing. So it wouldn't be able to learn it at all without having that thing on board. Yeah?
Fascinating talk. So how do you explain flash bulb memory, which may not be related to any existing schemas?
Okay. Who thinks that the assassination of President Kennedy was not related to any existing schemas? Okay, that's one thing. Secondly, research on flashbulb memories has indicated, I don't do this work myself, but it's indicated that people have high confidence in their memories, but they are no more reliable than they are for fairly uninteresting events. Why do they have high confidence in their memories? Well, one possibility is that they engage in a certain amount of rehearsal, but that rehearsal itself actually may involve some distortion and sort of, I don't know, culturally specific sort of like in re-envisionment of the actual experience itself. And so vividness ratings are high, confidence is high, but accuracy is not high. I do believe that highly salient experiences result in stronger initial storage. And there's many reasons to think that's true. Jim McGaw's work has all been about that over many decades. But at the same time, a replay event will interact with your existing knowledge and start to create distortions, which have been studied since Broadbent, sorry, not Broadbent, that was Bartlett. They had the same job at different times at the same university and just 30 years earlier, but Bartlett studied how our knowledge causes distortions in our memory, and it stabilizes over many repetitions. So if you repeated it many times as you talk to your friends about where you were on 9/11 and so on, you might end up thinking you were in the room with those friends when the event occurred, but you weren't. You just talked to them afterwards several days later, 2 or 3 times maybe, and that's what, right? So that's basically my answer to that question. Yes? Yeah, I give you a chance now.
So I just wonder when you want to evaluate if the network is learning something correctly or not, you add one node. So in the brain, it means that the brain is recruiting more neural resources
Yeah, isn't that a terrible part of my model? I really hate that part. Why do we use these, single brand new units to make these points? Well, one nice thing about it is that it at least orthogonalizes something in the network, right? So I don't actually think that's the way it works. Okay, just to be clear, when I say when I give you the name of a new object, I believe that your auditory language processing cortex has learned how to create a relatively differentiated representation for every new pattern of syllables in your language. So the word cardinal will be relatively distinct from the word corporal, for example, which is quite similar to it, right? So it's an exaggeration of that idea. It's certainly true that for the sake of words having arbitrarily different meanings, it's important that we have a representation of distinct words that makes similar words different so that we don't confuse their meanings, and we're just exaggerating that here, I would say, if we thought about it as actual words. I think, that points out a fundamental tension, which is on the one hand, you do want to differentiate things from each other for the sake of giving them their individual name. Like each of you two gentlemen have a different name, and I would have to differentiate you in order to correctly assign it. But it actually also turns out that I'm much better at that in my own culture than I am for faces from a culture with which I'm less experienced, right? So Asians with white people and white people with Asians, they have better luck within their culture than across their cultures. So the differentiation occurs as a result of immersion in a culture, and then you have the differentiated starting place on which to build those separate memories. And the downside of that is I want there to actually be all the shared structure. So I know a lot about someone because I know they're a person, right? At the same time that I need to differentiate them. So that's something my theory I don't think fully addresses, and it's a place for further elaboration. But it's a good question. Thank you. Yeah.
So regarding the sparseness of the activation of the cortex versus the hippocampus you talked about, right? In artificial intelligence, it's been shown that using dropouts in the layers leads to more redundant information in the network, and you essentially get that non-sparsity. And that helps with generalization of the model.
Yeah.
So it seems like there is a very nice relationship between
Right. I totally agree with that. Yeah. There must be some middle ground here, right? And I like this comment that I snuck in that I learned from Bruce recently, right? Which is this idea that really there's, for every pattern, some of the neurons are very, are activated much of the time, and then the tail of the distribution involves neurons that are activated much, much less frequently. That may be one of the ways of solving this problem of getting as much shared structure as you can, while from the ones that are activated more often, that are going to be part of, okay, this is a human being, so whatever I know about humans will be relevant here. And then, okay, this is, the person who has those particular glasses and that particular beard, that's going to allow me to learn the things that are specific to that individual. So I think more exploration of that idea is going to be important. I think obviously it's time for us to move on to the next event, so thank you very much.